Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to today's social smorgasbord as part of the Feeding the Future Festival. It's lovely to see you all, especially inside when it's such a lovely day outside, but there will be opportunities to go out and have some delicious food and soak up a bit of sunshine later on. So today we've got a session that includes two quite diverse little talks. Mine is historical. I'm an Associate Professor of History here at UWA. And then later on we have one about energy drinks as well. And it's kind of policy oriented, I guess, isn't it? So mine is also a little bit policy oriented. I'm interested in what we can derive from an historical understanding to inform policy today around urban agriculture for more sustainable and resilient cities. So I've been studying this question for quite some time, and I'll be providing just a short overview, a taster, if you like, for you today. So I'd like you to start by imagining what we would do in our Australian cities if there was some kind of urgent or acute threat to food supply. It might be the nature of a general strike, for example, or flooding, such as we saw in Brisbane in 2011, which saw the supermarket shelves empty very, very quickly indeed. And there were some real fears around the ongoing food supply at that time. Or fuel supply. In Britain, I think around 2008, there was a fuel strike, which led one of the House of Lords to suggest that Britain was 9 meals away from anarchy, because once the fuel was unavailable, they couldn't truck food around the country. And again, supermarket shelves started emptying very quickly. Or there's the more slow burn threats, such as climate change. If climate change outstrips our capacity to adapt in terms of agriculture, then that could have some really very serious flow-on effects for the availability of food in our cities. Similarly, if petrol prices keep going up, the ability to provide cheap fuel at a rate that is commensurate with food costs, then food is going to become increasingly expensive and unaffordable for a wider range of people. There's also urban expansion, as urban expansion moves into our peri-urban food bowls. In Melbourne, for example, the peri-urban food bowl produces 40% of the city's fruit and vegetables. So as that land is taken over through poor planning decisions, then that puts further pressure on our food system. So there's these quite slow threats that might happen over a number of years, or the very acute ones that are due to some kind of natural disaster. But in between, we have the example of the Second World War in Australia, where particularly after 1941, when the Japanese entered the war, the Pacific Theatre begins. There's more service people in the region, so Australia is having to feed a larger number of people. Our supply lines are cut off for agricultural inputs such as rubber. The Japanese take over Malaya, that's where our rubber comes from, so we don't have as much access to that important agricultural input. Fertilisers, pesticides, supplies of those which were often imported, again, are diminished as the war expands at that time. And we're also still trying to feed Britain because, of course, the mother country's food supply has been cut off through the war as well, and they're under more serious pressure than we are. So in 1941, the Australian food system is really starting to look a little bit pressured, and that increases into 1942 and 1943. So some of the responses to that include cranking up the agriculture. So many of the men, of course, left to go and fight in the war. So a lot of women were drafted to agricultural labour, and they expanded the available acreages. But again, there were problems because of the lack of agricultural inputs. The problems acquiring sufficient fertilisers and pesticides meant that the agricultural output wasn't as high. So one of the early responses was a women's garden army, which was established by the Young Women's Christian Association in Melbourne in 1942. And in this very much grassroots organisation, women, worked in land that had been donated by local governments and by local landholders who had large gardens that were going uncultivated. So they went in there and grew vegetables, and women with day jobs during the week would go on weekends, and those who were homemakers would work on these gardens during the week. And they sold the produce at fairs, and they were able to buy the produce themselves at a reduced cost. And school children and Boy Scouts and Girl Guides pitched in with the harvest and so on. So it was very much a local, women-oriented food production system, a kind of ground-up one. A different one was initiated by the federal government in 1943, and this was a large-scale grow-your-own campaign. And this was a top-down model whereby they initiated this very large advertising campaign in the newspapers, in magazines, on radio, and through things like stickers on bills. What else? They had competitions, gardening competitions, and so on. So a range of different means to try and get people to grow their own food in their own backyards. It did encounter some difficulties. Because it was a federal campaign, it missed out, it wasn't able to take into account local variations in what was good to plant when and where. It also didn't account for some of the regional variations in the availability of those important inputs again. You know, it suggested using certain types of fertilisers or pesticides when they were completely unavailable in certain areas. So there were some coordination problems. But it was probably quite effective. It had some precedents. So this kind of campaign approach to encouraging people to grow their own food in urban situations in particular had its origins in the First World War. So these are some women in the English, I think it was, Garden Army. No, it was a victory campaign, that's right, in the UK during the First World War. And similarly, the National War Garden Commission in the USA in the First World War was very active in encouraging people to grow their own food. And this was not only because of perceived or actual threats to the food supply, but also to encourage a sense of patriotism so that people felt like they were being part of the war effort through growing and preserving their own food. Here's an ad from the UK in 1941, the Dig for Victory campaign, where, as you can see, women are being exhorted to grow their own food so that the farmers can provide other kinds of food and they don't have to produce vegetables that can be grown in suburban allotments or suburban backyards. Although some of the propaganda was a bit contradictory. Here we have a very a masculine kind of approach to food production. This is one of my favourite pictures. This is from London during the Second World War. This is a bomb crater that has been converted into an allotment garden in the middle of London. So it's a kind of, I don't know, a very inspirational image of the kind of a positive response to one of the conditions that has been produced by a terrible event. Here we go back to the Second World War. So this is from the US, a private enterprise approach to victory gardening, encouraging employees to get involved and to produce their own food, and encouraging that through the provision of plots and also prizes for production. So here's some more of the material from the US. They came up with some great posters to try and encourage people to grow their own food. Our food is fighting. Not all food production is very environmentally friendly, of course, so we need to bear in mind that it's not all good environmentally, or certainly wasn't in those times. There's some more sinister connections between war and food production. Here's one from Australia, the Australian Grow Your Own campaign. You can see it's very much along the same lines as the American ones. Now, so what can we learn from these campaigns in the UK, the US and also Australia? Well, firstly, that rapid expansion of home food production does seem possible if you motivate enough people. There's some statistics from the UK that prior to the Second World War, there were 819,000 allotments. Allotment gardens have a long and venerable tradition in the UK, and they're like our community gardens where people who live in an area rent a small plot that they can go to and grow vegetables. So there were 819,000 prior to the war, and then during the war that doubled. They've estimated that there were 3 million private vegetable gardens prior to the war, and again that increased to 5 million during the war. But those statistics are very rubbery, I have to say. We don't really know. They were just best estimates at the time. Similarly, in the USA, there were estimated to be almost 20 million victory gardens by the end of the Second World War. But again, that's just someone's best guess. We don't really know. Still, anecdotal evidence in all of these contexts suggests that there certainly was a significant increase in food production as a result of these patriotic campaigns. So here's a group of school children in Essendon working on the school vegetable garden. Here's a bloke in, I think, Camberwell or Brighton or something in Melbourne who's devoted his entire front garden to vegetable cultivation. Here's a group at the local church, again, I think in Brighton, happily harvesting vegetables, and a women's garden army group in Brighton, again, preparing a plot for vegetable production. So images like this suggest that, yes, people were actively growing their own vegetables, and it's very likely that the amount of production increased. However, events that reduce access to food supply are also likely to reduce access to the materials needed to grow food, as I've already said. So there were these shortages of rubber, pesticides, seeds and fertilisers. There was also a shortage of know-how. So we can see here that one of the images that they circulated during the Second World War campaign in Australia was one that said, "Help your neighbour to get the best out of his garden," interestingly, seeing as many of the gardeners were women, suggesting that many people had grown up not knowing how to grow their own vegetables. So there was a lack of capacity for food production in terms of the knowledge that you needed to do it successfully. So this suggests that this kind of capacity needs to be maintained. We need to actively maintain the kind of knowledge that we would need to sustain food production. Gardeners then also had better access to animals for manure, so resilient food gardens will need to plan for sourcing inputs locally and closing the loop. Cities of the 1940s also had more open space, and the more spacious suburbs were more productive than the inner city. So as the density of our cities increases, our capacity to grow food in them correspondingly declines, and that's something I think that we need to be proactive in planning for. Town planning needs to think about maintaining space for productive gardening. And we also might need to think about how and where we garden in cities in terms of rooftop gardens, vertical gardens and so on. And there's lots of work being done in that space. Now thirdly, of course, these top-down food growing campaigns were also about producing a particular kind of citizen, patriotic, thrifty, industrious and responsible, and with particular roles for men and women, as we see, although in practice I think these were often challenged. So thinking about future campaigns of this nature, it's important, I think, to keep this in mind. While we're nurturing a new kind of city, we're also fostering particular kinds of values and attitudes, although hopefully this time it would be things like inclusivity, cooperation and generosity. Also, while the language of war can be quite motivating, it also implies compulsion and duty. So it's about hardship and collective sacrifice rather than satisfaction and enjoyment. And I think after the Second World War, food gardening didn't disappear, but it certainly did decline. So while change is urgently needed, I think the rhetoric of war is unlikely to produce sustainable change. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about using the rhetoric of war to try and encourage greater or expanded urban food production and home food production today. So our cities have always produced food. Even very recently, people think that our cities have been largely unproductive. But in 1992, Perth households produced 5,299.9 tonnes of vegetables. You know, that's a significant quantity of vegetables, really. You know, more than 1 million dozen eggs, 67 tonnes of nuts, and somewhere between 30 and 40% of households in the metro area likely produce some food, although in most cases that would have been very little. So they've always produced food, but the kind and level of production has depended on the availability of suitable land and other resources, how the activity fits in with the physical infrastructure and processes of the city, as well as the lifestyles and ideals of its residents. So these are the kinds of things that we can learn from looking at the past of urban food production. So thank you very much to all of these people for providing my pictures, and thank you to you for coming along and listening. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
You had 1992 ABS survey stats. Is there any later than that? Oh, for goodness sakes. Okay, and just a comment. I noticed Help Your Neighbour had the men there in the picture as if they had the knowledge. In the previous slide, the Women's Army or something, and they were the workers. So that was an interesting observation.
I know they were quite conflicted about the gender dynamics because the idea was that the male was the breadwinner, the male was the producer. But in reality, many of the men were off at war or they were drafted into other wartime occupations. So women were the ones doing a lot of the vegetable production. And in fact, in reality, women had always done a lot of the vegetable production because men were often off at work during the day and women had a lower formal workforce participation rate. So you get this interesting conflict between the representation and the actual reality of what was going on. No, it's unfortunate that there's no very firm statistics. It's always been very difficult to get statistics on home food production. I did my PhD thesis on this topic and I scoured the archives and a lot of it was just estimates. Once you get beyond the era in the 19th, 20th and early 20th century where policemen are going around collecting agricultural statistics and they include urban areas in that. So for the 19th century, you get this incredible picture of, 3 million chickens in central Melbourne, for example. It's fantastic. But for the 20th century, you don't have very much of that at all. I actually rang up the Bureau of Statistics and said, is there any more data that's not, reported? And they said, no, sorry, it's one of the great unasked census questions, unfortunately. Well, I think they'll start to become more interested now. There's a very big movement in Melbourne towards greater urban food production. Perth is a little slower to catch on, but I think we'll get there eventually. I mean, there certainly has been an expansion in community gardens, for example. People keeping their own poultry in recent years has increased after a long period of decline through the 20th century. Even local governments are starting to reform their approaches to productive animals in suburban areas because they realise that it's important that we maintain that productive capacity. Anyone else? No? Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand over to our next presenters.
Okay, so before we start, we're just going to hand out some energy drinks to you all.
Yeah, just pass them around, please.
Okay, so I suppose the first question is, has anyone in this room actually purchased... Oh, thanks. Particularly considering my voice is a good idea. Has anybody in this room ever purchased an energy drink? Hands up. Don't be shy. Okay, so probably about half, 60% of you. Okay.
Our next question is, what do you think that the laws regarding energy drinks in Australia currently are? Does anybody have any idea?
It's okay that you don't.
Well, it's a good thing that you came here today.
Okay, which country do you think has potentially the toughest laws on energy drinks? If you thought energy drinks
any
attracted
guesses?
any law.
Denmark.
You're definitely on the right track. It is not Denmark, but stay tuned during the next 20 plus minutes and we will tell you the answer to that question.
It's true.
Drum roll, please.
Okay, so today what we're going to do is to basically cover, well, what is considered to be an energy drink and how is that different from perhaps sports drinks or other carbonated drinks? What are the health impacts of energy drinks, if anything? We'll also have a look at what is the marketing of energy drinks and the message that energy drink companies are sending to consumers. Clearly why we're here is we're going to talk about the law regarding energy drinks in Australia and some overseas countries as well. Then what we'll do is we will tell you what our recommendations are based on our research for what the stance of energy drink regulation should be. And we'll also, if we've got time, also provide a bit of audio from one of the interviews that we've done on the ABC Law Report concerning the legal regulation of energy drinks. Okay, so what are energy drinks? Well, energy drinks basically are caffeinated beverages that contain large amounts of caffeine. The amount of caffeine within an energy drink is prescribed in the standard, which I'll go through with you later, but also energy drinks contain other additives such as vitamins, minerals, taurine, gluconoractone, and a few other properties that they often put into energy drinks as well. Within energy drinks, there is actually the claim, and it's located within the applicable Australian standard, that they improve mental performance. So I'll go through that with you in a second. But that's one of the things that distinguishes energy drinks from other beverages on the market, is that there is actually this claim that they improve mental performance in some way, and there is also a restricted amount of caffeine that's contained within them. And it's not difficult for anybody to appreciate that this is the energy drinks themselves. They are a big business globally, but especially in Australia as well per capita. It's $1 billion industry. So there's big dollars in keeping them available for consumers to buy. Are there any health impacts of energy drinks? Well, yes, there are. Principally, the negative health effects of energy drinks emanate from increased caffeine consumption. So if you have too much caffeine, and that is what's located principally within the energy drink, then you can suffer some of these health effects. Sorry about my voice, I've inexplicably partially lost it this morning. So if you have too many energy drinks, it can lead to sensations of a rapid or irregular heart rate. People have experienced sleeplessness when they've had too much caffeine, particularly considering, correlated with energy drinks. They've also had a feeling of just being sick, of vomiting, of general irritability and restlessness, and there are other side effects associated with it as well, such as gastrointestinal upset, stomach cramps, etc., etc. So there's a number of side effects that consumers have experienced with increased consumption of caffeine through energy drinks. The actual marketing of the energy drinks themselves often centres around the fact that if you have an energy drink, it will allow you to have greater energy, to have greater concentration, to have greater stamina and endurance, and often the marketing of these beverages often reflects those tenets. Excuse me. The main themes around energy drink consumption and the advertisements concerning energy drinks are often associated with increased risk-taking behaviour, extreme sports such as snowboarding or rock climbing. For me, who doesn't exercise very much, I consider those extreme sports, and general risk-taking behaviour. And the premise underlying all of those is that if you consume an energy drink, these will allow you to feel more emboldened to undertake these activities, to engage in risk-taking behaviour, to have greater stamina, to have more alertness, increased capacity for your study, concentration, etc., 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 because of the premise that it contains those. In addition, the actual standard, and I'll talk about that in a second particularly, but the standard that contains the definition and the premise of what energy drinks are, which is the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code, actually says that a formulated caffeinated beverage, which is an energy drink, contains caffeine and I'm reading directly from the standard, has the purpose of enhancing mental performance. So you can see why the energy drink companies, because it's prescribed in the standard, really talk about this concept of it'll increase your ability to study, to concentrate, to do stuff, to generally enhance your mental performance. So what is the law concerning energy drinks in this country? Well, energy drinks themselves used to be sold and regulated under the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Arrangement or Agreement. What that basically meant was that goods which are sold in New Zealand could be sold in Australia and vice versa. So equally, goods sold in Australia could be sold in New Zealand because there's a lot of reciprocity between the two countries. Currently, the actual legal ability to sell energy drinks falls under standard 2.6.4 of the code, the Food Standards Code, which is jointly administered by Australia and New Zealand. And what that prescribes is that in order to be classed as an energy drink, the beverage must contain between 145 and 320 milligrams of caffeine per litre. Now, if it's below 145 milligrams of caffeine, it cannot be classed as an energy drink. Equally, if it's above 320 milligrams of caffeine per litre, then it's not an energy drink. In terms of where energy drinks and their caffeine content fall compared with other caffeinated beverages is really, really interesting. So if we, and I'm just going to refer to this because my ability to add numbers is severely compromised. I can read, but I can't really add. So effectively, I'll just pull this up. When you look at the amount of caffeine in an energy drink compared to, say, a can of Coke or a cup of coffee, a can of Coke typically contains, and I'm going to do this milligrams per litre as a standard measurement. I know you have less than a litre of Coke, but I'm going to do it as milligrams per litre. So when you look at a can of Coke, that equates to about 106 to 133 milligrams per litre of caffeine. Not too bad. An energy drink, because we've seen the formulated caffeinated beverage requirement in standard 2.6.4 of the code, says that it has to contain between 145 to 320 milligrams per litre of caffeine. So right there, you've automatically seen that an energy drink will contain more caffeine than a regular can of Coke. But let's keep going. A percolated coffee, depending on how strong or weak you make it, will contain between 240 and 480 milligrams per litre of caffeine. That tells you that potentially a percolated coffee may or may not, depending on how strong you make it, actually contain more caffeine than an energy drink. But wait, there's more. Because if you go to a cafe and order a double shot flat white coffee from the cafe, then averaging it out to milligrams per litre, that will contain approximately 869 milligrams per litre of caffeine. And you're like, Justine and Marilyn, sorry, what? You've just basically told us that some coffees, depending on how you make it and who makes it, can actually contain more caffeine than an energy drink. But you're standing up here and basically saying, well, you know, this is why we want to talk about energy drinks, and we're going to tell you, you know, maybe you should perhaps think about them. The reason for that is because the way you drink a coffee is fundamentally different to the way you drink an energy drink. It's not uncommon for people, particularly who's got a 250ml can of energy drink. Hold it up. Don't be frightened. There you go, up the back. They're not that big. They're pretty small. They're smaller than the can of Coke. They're really easy to clutch. They're cold. Depending on your palate, they don't taste that bad. So effectively, the way people drink energy drinks is quite different to coffee. Because with a coffee, you don't slam down 5 or 6 in one setting. Why? They're hot. They're meant to be sipped. They're meant to be enjoyed slowly. And they're meant to be cooled to a palatable temperature so that you, at the end of the day, regulate your consumption of them. So most people I know don't go out and drink 4 or 5, you know, double shot flat whites from a cafe in one hit and then get up and walk away and say, right, you know, I've had enough. So the behaviour of how energy drinks are consumed needs to be considered in relation to how we drink normal coffee. In addition, the actual labelling requirements on energy drinks are provided in the code. And basically what it says is you have to say that it contains caffeine. You have to let them know how much caffeine is in there. You have to tell them how many drinks that they should stop, what the maximum number of energy drinks per day that they should consume is. And in addition, there should be an advisory statement there that says basically children, pregnant women, anybody that's lactating, which would be women now that I think about it, or anybody that's vulnerable, you know, that has, you know, heart conditions or whatever, should not consume those energy drinks. The real question is, how many people actually read those things? In addition, the code doesn't actually restrict who can buy energy drinks and how many. So you could get a 10-year-old child walking into your local IGA and buying 50 cans of energy drinks and no one's going to stop him. So there are real issues concerning, is the legal regulation of energy drinks in this country sufficient, given what we know on the subject? And I'll now pass you over to Marilyn. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I don't think we introduced ourselves properly earlier.
that's
Justine, sorry, we're so excited to be here. Justine Howard from the University of Notre Dame Law School. I'm Marilyn Bromberg from the UWA Law School. Just in case you were wondering, my accent is Canadian. I was imported to Perth about 11 years ago. So, and also before I forget, I also want to thank Verity and everyone else who did a great job organizing today. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about laws overseas involving energy drinks, in addition to the recommendations that Justine and I have made regarding energy drink legislation. So let's start with EU. So in the EU, they have laws regarding energy drinks, particularly the labeling. So every energy drink has to have a label that says high caffeine content, not recommended for children or pregnant or breastfeeding women. This label needs to be in the same field of vision as the name of the energy drink. Energy drink also has to state the amount of caffeine per 100 milliliters. And as well, so I know that all of you were dying earlier to find out about the country with the toughest energy drink laws, and that's Lithuania. So at the moment, it's the only country in the world that we are aware of that bans the sale of energy drinks to under 18s. So in the EU as well, there's a voluntary code of practice for the marketing and labeling of energy drinks. So the key word here is voluntary. So it's a recommendation to all the energy drinks manufacturers in the EU. So in particular, they recommend that energy drinks should be a 250 milliliter size, so on the smaller end. Although, as Justine mentioned, when you have an energy drink that small, you might be more likely to just gulp it up quickly because it's cold, and for many people, the sugar makes it taste palatable. To me, it kind of makes me kind of want to spit it out, but to many, it makes it taste palatable. Don't market to children under 12 years old. So, in particular, in terms of marketing to children under 12 years old versus, say, 15 years old, it's quite possible that when you try to not market to one age group, you're actually marketing to another age group, because it's hard to define, 12 to 13, well, is this advertisement, more for 13-year-olds or 12-year-olds? So while they might say don't market to children under 12 years old, if they're marketing to teenagers who are 14, an 11-year-old might see that and decide to buy an energy drink. Mixing with alcohol. So this code of practice recommends that they don't promote having energy drinks mixed with alcohol. And well, we don't have the time to get into it today. When energy drinks are mixed with alcohol, it can be quite dangerous, because when they're ingested together, people are more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior. They're more likely to drunk drive. They're more likely to be violent. So the medical research has found that. These are just some of the key aspects of that voluntary code of conduct. So in the United States, some researchers have said that the United States has, among the Western world, the worst legislation when it comes to energy drinks. And I think in Australia, the term might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I am still relatively new to this country, a dog's breakfast. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. So essentially, just briefly, energy drink companies can decide whether they want to classify their energy drink as either a beverage or a dietary supplement. Now, if they choose dietary supplement, the labeling is much laxer than if they choose beverage. Okay, so they don't have to include as much on the label. But if they go with the beverage component, then they have to state to the FDA anytime they have an adverse reaction. So if someone from the public has an adverse reaction, they have to go to the FDA. So at the moment, energy drink companies can choose which one they'll call themselves. And so that's unlike, for example, in Australia, where all energy drink companies, as long as they fit under the definition of energy drink, they all have the same legislation that will apply. Now, in Maine and Kentucky, legislation was introduced, but it didn't actually become passed, that would not allow the sale of energy drinks to under 18s, okay? And then in Maryland, legislation was introduced, but it wasn't actually passed, that would require energy drink companies not to sell energy drinks in vending machines, and also banning the sale of energy drinks to under 18s. Now, the American Beverage Association also has a voluntary guidance for energy drink companies similar to in the EU, and in particular, they state that they don't encourage energy drink companies to advertise energy drinks to under 12s. In the United States, there have been a bunch of lawsuits involving energy drinks. And I'm actually going to start with the last one listed there, because I just think it's funny. I think you might find it funny as well. So Benjamin Carruthers sued Red Bull. Is anybody familiar with the Red Bull advertisement that Red Bull will give you wings? Anybody heard it? So he ingested Red Bull for many years. And he was very upset because, I know you're all going to find this very surprising, he did not grow wings. So he sued Red Bull because he did not grow wings. And they settled, they had a $10 million settlement, but the settlement was that anyone, I think in the US, who had consumed Red Bull could get $10 by way of compensation for not getting their wings. Anyway, I find, yeah, I'm a litigator myself. I find that, glad I could share that with you. Okay, so then in terms of other lawsuits, so there was a 14-year-old woman who had a previous heart condition. She consumed 2 cans of Monster energy drink, and she died within about 24 hours. And her family started a lawsuit against the energy drink company. It's, I believe, the first that has actually gone to trial because all the other ones have settled. I haven't been able to find a judgment yet in terms of what the verdict was. So then a 33-year-old man in the US, he died within about 45 minutes of ingesting energy drink and then playing basketball, and his family as well started a wrongful death lawsuit. And then Alex Morris, as well, 19 years old, consumed a few cans of energy drink, of Monster, and then died. And then Alex's family as well started a wrongful death lawsuit. And I haven't been able to find the judgment for that yet. But just in terms of how judgments work, normally after you'll have a trial, and it could take anywhere from 6 months to a year to get a judgment handed down. So. In Canada, they decided to regulate energy drinks as food, and so they limit the amount in energy drinks, the caffeine, to approximately the amount in a medium coffee, and they also have comparable labeling laws to those we have in Australia. Now, Justine and I wrote a paper on the topic of energy drinks and law, and we were fortunate that the Journal of Law and Medicine published it. It's called Red Bull, Does It Give You Wings or Cardiac Disturbances? I get a little bit of a kick out of naming journal articles with my co-authors. Modifying the law regarding energy drinks in Australia. So Verity kindly printed out a bunch of these, so they're at the front if you would like to read it. Now, in that article, Justine and I made some recommendations in this area. So first and foremost, restrict the sales of energy drinks to people aged 18 and over. And so we looked at different legislation, different, I guess, ways of legislating this area that might work. And so we thought that how alcohol is legislated, maybe that could apply to energy drinks, in that alcohol is something that so many Australians consume. Yet, if you consume it in excess, there can be significant problems. So we thought, well, energy drinks can be similar in terms of people are consuming them en masse, but also if you consume a lot of them, there can be dangers. So we thought maybe make it similar to how alcohol is legislated in Australia. Also restrict the marketing of energy drinks to over 18. So that goes hand in hand with only selling to over 18s, but obviously there can be problems in that if you say that this ad is for a 19-year-old, 17-year-old might see and decide to ingest energy drinks, but nevertheless, you get the basic idea. Targeted health campaigns. So we thought that there should be a lot of health promotion to make the public aware of the dangers of energy drinks, because so many people don't know how bad they are for you. In fact, I only learned that they were so bad for you maybe 4 years ago. I was in Fremantle in a convenience store, and I saw this kid who looked maybe 8 or 9 buying like 12 of these energy drinks. And I was just thinking, hold on, like just instinctively, that doesn't seem right. And so then I started looking into it, and then I found out about the negative repercussions that are possible when ingesting energy drinks. But I just had no idea until then. A national reporting center. So people who experience negative health impacts from ingesting energy drinks, they can contact this national reporting center and let them know. So that way it'll be easy to keep data about the negative health repercussions of ingesting energy drinks. And also, we think that more research is required. So energy drinks are relatively new. They haven't been around very long. So we need more research about the long-term impacts of ingesting them, and particularly among young people. And also, we need research about in jurisdictions where there is any sort of legislation regarding energy drinks, what are the impacts of that? So in terms of other legislation involving energy drinks, there have been some cities in the US, like, for example, Seattle, like San Francisco, where they passed legislation that taxes energy drinks and other sugary drinks. So I'd love to see research about, well, if you tax energy drinks, does that affect consumption? You know, and by how much as well? So we actually don't have much time. So Justine and I were very fortunate. We appeared on the ABC Law Report and were able to discuss this issue. We don't have much time. I'm thinking, do you think we don't have enough time to play. No. Okay, so maybe we'll just
Google it.
We'll just take some questions then.
Yeah.
Thanks. For the record, I don't drink this stuff anymore, nor do I drink coffee. But I was wondering, is there data about who's consuming the drinks? Because obviously, like, younger people shouldn't be drinking it. But is there data to say that they're the ones that drink it the most, or
there
anything
is.
that can be used to justify it?
Yep, so for example, in WA with the RAIN study, they collected that sort of data, and also that kind of data was presented. Deakin University held a energy drinks conference. I forget the exact name of it, in 2014, and they shared that some of that information as well. The numbers, the ages of people who are consuming energy drinks, but a lot of it, for what I've read, is teens until about the age of 30, and actually more male than female.
Any other questions?
Like, is there any action being done in schools? Like, because there's health class and whatever, and I know we didn't really listen, but like, what's being done at the schools then?
At the moment, in WA, not much. But Marilyn and I are part of further research. We can't sort of really talk about it at the moment, but we're part of further research, and that is something that our research is going to look at as well, because clearly, something does need to be done in terms of, if we know the demographic is, young people right up to the age of 30, then clearly schools need to be targeted. Yeah.
Thanks. At sports centres, you have I didn't know actually that there was a difference, but you have the sports drinks next to the energy drinks. I actually thought they were, one and the same. Could you just distinguish between the two?
Sure.
Having consumed sports drinks at one stage, but I never actually ventured into the energy, so I'm just wondering what's the difference. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Often they can be confusing because often, they look a little bit similar and they have similar, aims that they're trying to espouse, such as endurance and, hydration and all the rest of it. The principal difference is that with energy drinks, you've got this 145 to 320 milligrams per litre of caffeine. It's classed as a formulated caffeinated beverage within the code, and it's for the purpose of enhancing mental performance, and it contains caffeine. With sports drinks, they don't. So they don't contain caffeine. They contain things like vitamins, minerals, supplements, that really is just for the purpose of hydration, replacing electrolytes, etc., etc. So sports drinks themselves, because they don't contain caffeine and they don't exist for the purpose of enhancing mental performance, they are not classed as a formulated caffeinated beverage, an energy drink.
Can they still spike the heart or something like that?
We haven't done research on sports drinks. However, I can't see why they could, because they don't contain caffeine, and that's the principal problem with the energy drinks. Yeah. Yes.
Wouldn't the sugar in the drinks also have an effect on palpitations and
No.
hyper?
Good question, actually. Good question. No, the palpitations and the tremors and the cardiac disturbances, they come from the caffeine. The sugar really is related to obesity, which is a national problem. And that's a broader issue in terms of the foods and the drinks that people are consuming, and are they contributing to the obesity epidemic. But no, it's not. The sugar's really related to obesity rather than anything to do with cardiac disturbances.
And one other issue though with the sugar is it damages teeth.
Yeah.
So
true.
we've read about energy drinks causing tooth decay.
Yep. Any more questions? No. Thanks very much.
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.